one kind or another, and ammunition. And if you were too poor, they had ways to deal with that. They might find you a way to sell your produce. You're a poor farmer. You bring your produce in. They'll help you sell it so you can get your money. If you were an urban individual, they might get you a job. I mean, the statute's provided for this. Get you a job. If you were maybe unemployable at the time, the town would raise the money through taxes, or the militia might raise the money because the militia collected fines from its members who failed to perform various functions, and they would buy you a gun. So, contrary to the kind of gun control we have today, where the idea seems to be to take guns away from people, in those days gun control meant putting guns into everybody's hands. And then they all had to come out on a regular basis, sometimes 4 times a year, 6 times a year, might be more often if they were in a wartime situation, French and Indian War, for instance, or the War of Independence. The training schedule called these people out more often. And they'd come out for regular discipline and exercise, as they called it, because, they fought in linear tactics. The pictures of the people lining up 2 deep or 3 deep and maneuvering in large groups. So that required a lot of close order drill, and that was essentially what they did, a certain amount of target practice and close order drill, so that they could function in the same way that the regular armed forces functioned, although, of course, if you were dealing with people in New England or the frontier regions of Pennsylvania or Virginia and so forth, they were more along the line of guerrilla fighters because they, of course, were dealing with the Indians who didn't fight in normal battlefield tactics. So that was that element of training. Now, it's interesting that element of training and the firearms that those people used were at the level of the regular armed forces. I mean, the typical firearms that a man would buy, and many of them had actual muskets that were the same pattern as the British Army or the French Army, and the other firearms that they had were equivalent. I mean, a Kentucky rifle, in fact, was probably superior to a British musket in almost all uses, except that it couldn't fit a bayonet. So we weren't talking about a great differentiation between what the militia people had and what the regular armed forces had in terms of, let's say, firepower.
Right. All right, Doctor, let me ask you this question, and you pretty well covered that. How do we get a legal militia today?
Oh, well, let's start from the top. And the top, of course, is Congress, and the fish rots at the head, right? So,
right, but forget Congress. They're not going to do anything.
We can forget about Congress. We can forget about Congress right now. I mean, I would like to say that we could just draft a statute. I could draft a statute, someone hand it to somebody in Congress, and they pass it, but wrong. That won't happen. The reality of the Constitution is that Congress is there for the purpose of promoting uniformity in these state institutions. Right? Congress's power is not really supreme in the sense that it's the top of the pyramid. It's there to make sure that the lower levels of the pyramid have some uniformity in terms of equipment and tactics and what have you. So we really have to look to the states fundamentally. These things are the militia of the several states, not of the United States. So we need to go to our state legislatures. Well, our problem is that our state legislators probably don't know any more about this than the average congressman does. As I say, this has been moribund for a long time. And that's why you see with this Homeland Security business that has come up in Congress, what are the states tending to do? Well, they're tending to take directives or to fall into line with the Department of Homeland Security. Well, the Department of Homeland Security isn't even, I mean, it has no relationship to a militia, period.
I understand that.
Nothing, all right? So my proposal is looking at the state legislatures as the target. We have to get some statutes presented to state legislatures and enacted. Well, that means we have to educate state legislators, and we have to make them aware that they have a large block within their constituents who want this kind of reform, because we don't want top-down Homeland Security organizing. We want constitutional organizing, which is from the bottom up, where the people control, not some elite bunch of bureaucrats in the District of Columbia.
Okay, let me say this. I know here in the state of Texas that we have the Texas National Guard. Mm-hmm. If the National Guard, say, for instance, in my hometown gets called up, then we have what is called the Texas State Guard that goes in and takes their place. Now, is the Texas State Guard a militia?
Well, I'm not sure when you say Texas State Guard. There is a statute that provides for things called state defense forces. Congress passed this statute. And here in Virginia, it's called the Virginia Defense Force. And that's exactly what it does. It's a small group. I think we have here less than 2,000 people. And they're all volunteers. And when the National Guard people go off to perform their functions, the state defense force people will come in, and if necessary, they'll take over administration of the Guard armories and other facilities.
That's exactly what they do here in the state of Texas.
If they need them for crowd control or traffic control or whatever that the Guard might function in, that's what those people will do. Short answer, no, they are not a militia. They are an adjunct of the National Guard, which is an adjunct of the Army, so it's all one chain there. Now, some states, as I understand, I think New York is one, have entities called state guards, which are, from my looking at their statutes, they seem to be the vestigial remains of actual state militias. They're not part of this defense force. They're not part of the National Guard, although, of course, they'll cooperate with the National Guard and anything that goes on within their own state. But if you look at the New York one, which seems to be one of the better organized ones, it's very small. They have only about 60,000 people. Last time I looked at their website, I think that was the number that they gave. And again, it's a volunteer organization. So immediately you know this thing is really not up to the level of a militia organization that the Constitution requires. Basically, they're going in the right direction, but it's just a vestige. In a way, it's kind of a little appendix in history here to what they ought to have. But if you look at Virginia, as a for instance, we have the congressional structure, the organized militia, National Guard, Naval Militia, and State Defense Force. That's over on one side. And then we have this other thing called the unorganized militia. It's an oxymoron. You can't have that. So my proposal was, I wrote a book called Constitutional Homeland Security, with the emphasis on the word constitutional. And the idea is, well, first it explains in the book, gives an overview of what this problem is and why we need it to have proper homeland security and not a centralized police state, which is what some people in Washington seem to be developing, intentionally or through negligence, right? And then it comes down to the point that we need to do two things. First, we need to educate our own people. Certainly there are going to be spark plugs in every community who will understand this, without lengthy education. But they have to go and develop contact networks within their own areas. And I call these little activist groups Citizens Homeland Security Associations. Some people up in Connecticut who are working on this pretty actively call theirs Committees of Safety. I like that term. You can find them at committeesofsafety.org.
All right, Dr. Vieira, I want you to tell the people the name of that book that you were talking about and where they can get it.
It's called Constitutional Homeland Security. You can go to Amazon.com and find it, or you can get it from me at 52 Stonegate Court, Front Royal, Virginia, 22630. If you get it from me, it's $19.95 postpaid. Check a money order I don't deal with the banks. Thanks.
Okay, you told us about the militia. Now, I'm going to ask you a question, and if you don't want to answer it, just say pass, okay?
Sure.
What about Barack Obama? Is he really eligible to be president?
Well, we have two questions with Mr. Obama with respect to his eligibility. First and foremost, because he seems very concerned with keeping this information out of the public view, is precisely where and when was he born? Does he, in fact, have a birth certificate from Hawaii that tells us that information? And what has been posted on the Internet by some of these organizations like factcheck.org, that is not what we're actually looking for. So that's question number one. Obviously, if he was not born in the United States, then it would be essentially impossible for him to make any claim to be a natural-born citizen, which the Constitution requires as the basis for eligibility for the presidency. But even if he were born in the United States, there's another question. His father was a citizen of Kenya, and Kenya at that time was part of the British Empire. So under British law, and actually British law as it was at the time of the U.S. Constitution, as well as when Mr. Obama was born, took the position that if your father was a British citizen, you were a British citizen, and you could never change your citizenship. That was the end of it. So it's certainly possible to argue, and I would think from a constitutional perspective it's probably a pretty strong argument, that even if Mr. Obama was born in the United States, if his father was, as we know he was, because Obama admits that, his father was a Kenyan citizen, a British citizen of the British Empire, that his eligibility would be very seriously in question. But we have to factor into that the 14th Amendment, Section 1, which defined as a citizen of the United States any person born within the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof. So there's a little other step that we have to go through in the legal analysis. But point number one is clearly to see that birth certificate because that could very well clear up a great deal of the mystery, and we have to know the facts ultimately to be able to determine which line of constitutional inquiry we're going to go down. So I'm very suspicious. I mean, I've been an attorney for a long time. I don't do it anymore because I'm sick and tired of wasting time in this court system. So I'm spending time talking to the people who are ultimately in control of our Constitution, our government. But if he were my client, and we were in civil litigation, and the other side is making some challenge on some point of law, and he says, well, the answer is in my birth certificate. My birth certificate shows that I was born in the United States, and that answers this challenge from the other side. But then he refused